Rob, can you give us your thoughts on the renewable sector? Will President Trump, if he wins, gut or repeal the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, so my crystal ball might not be better than any of yours, but I think we've been saying for some time now that a full repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act has fairly low odds. We kind of give it a 10% probability. And I think Andrew's comments really just highlight the complexity of tinkering with the tax code. And so, maybe some of the provisions within the IRA are considered as part of sort of the general tax process. But I think it's probably a lot more complicated than just going in and doing a straight repeal. And I also think that, at least in my mind, uh, presidents really typically only get one piece of landmark legislation or one opportunity to work with Congress and do something profound. And they usually don't use that opportunity to reverse something that a prior president had done. So there's probably some sense that the Inflation Reduction Act would be somewhat safe, or at least some provisions within it could be safe, even under a Trump presidency. And I think there's very little change likely should Kamala Harris win. Now, that being said, I think one thing that a couple things to maybe just point out about the wind and solar space here in the U.S. is that demand has been growing relatively rapidly, and some of that demand is being pushed by incentives that are included within the IRA. But there are also just numerous other drivers of why we are seeing this build out of wind and solar additions in the US and really across the globe. And a lot of that has to do with the economics of the technology. A lot of it has to do with state level policy that the federal government has very limited purview over. And so, if former President Donald Trump wins, California is very unlikely as a result to change or modify any of its very aggressive climate goals and things like that. So I think you probably shouldn't be thinking about this as sort of a binary outcome where if former President Trump wins, that suddenly wind and solar are in big trouble. Now, I do think that perhaps if you kind of had to split hairs a little bit, perhaps there's a little bit more challenge that could come for the wind segment. President Trump has been very outspoken against the wind industry, and perhaps you could see some slowdown in federal permitting for the offshore wind space. Offshore wind is very nascent here in the US. We've got a lot of it over in Europe. It's still kind of emerging in the US. We're trying to figure out whether it's actually going to be a thing here or not. And just like President Biden has paused the permitting of LNG export facilities, perhaps a future president could come in and pause the permitting of offshore wind projects. So perhaps it gets involved in things like that. But again, I think these are long lead time projects. So generally, you probably don't need to be thinking about much near term disruption. Now, maybe just to bring it home on kind of if the IRA were to get repealed or provisions of the IRA were to be tinkered with as part of that general tax discussion idea that Andrew was talking about, I think the one perhaps to keep the biggest eye on would be the 45X manufacturing tax credit that was part of the IRA. That is a very important piece of the tax code that has onshored a lot of the manufacturing, particularly for the solar space. So China has been very dominant in solar manufacturing. They control, approaching 90% of the global supply chain. The IRA sort of started to reverse that a little bit. And so we had a pretty big build out of manufacturing in the US. So we could produce about 5-6 gigawatts of solar modules in the US prior to the IRA. I think the current count according to the Energy Industries Association, is that we've got about 40 gigawatts of production capacity. So we've gone from 5 to 40. And if you look at all the projects that are under construction, that's going to approach 80 gigawatts. So the US has a much larger ability to produce solar modules now. And if you were to get rid of that 45X tax provision, those factories would have to compete much more directly with low-cost Chinese manufacturers, and I think that would be a challenge. The anecdote that I always like to point out is First Solar. They've got really good disclosures. They allow you to sort of back out what the tax provisions mean for the company. And so right now they're running at a 45, 50% gross margin. If you get rid of the 45X tax credit, that falls to more like 20, 25%. So you see the margin get chopped in half if that piece of the tax code goes away. So it could be meaningful if that provision were to be attacked. I was just looking at the map of, where are all these factories at, not just for First Solar, but that have been built across since the IRA got passed. And many of them are in pretty red states. So First Solar is in Louisiana, Alabama. But then you kind of look, where are the other facilities? Georgia, Texas. They're not in California and New York. The manufacturing is really occurring in red states. So I think there might be some quiet diplomacy from some of the governors and state lawmakers to sort of keep some of those provisions in place, even under a Republican administration, just simply because that's where the factories are, that's where the jobs are. And so maybe even if you're philosophically opposed to the idea of energy subsidies, you might still want those facilities to continue to operate. So I hope that is a good frame. Happy to chat more about wind and solar at some other point. Thanks a lot, Nathan.